I'm Michael Hopkins for the MIT Sloan Management Review, and this is the panel on making digital transformation happen. Now, you might be forgiven for thinking that our collective digital transformation has already happened. We're all mobile, we're all on the cloud. What business hasn't already found itself swimming in social media or awash in data? We've all had computers on our desks for 30 years. So who isn't already winning with digital? Well, our esteemed panelists here today would say your company, probably, for one. The research that's been done by these three gentlemen to create an extraordinary new book called Leading Digital, Turning Technology into Digital Transformation, has shown that very, very few businesses out there are in fact already capitalizing on everything that the digital technology of today can do to compete. However, there's good news that they're going to bring as well, and the good news is that they have found some businesses, they call them digital masters, who already are creating what I could call a kind of strategy playbook for how companies can better compete using the technology capabilities that exist now and that are coming soon. We're going to talk about that playbook today, and we're going to talk about it, fortunately, with all three authors of this book. Let me introduce them to you and welcome them to our stage. First is George Westerman. George, welcome. George is the research scientist with MIT Sloan's Initiative on the Digital Economy and author previously of The Real Business of IT and IT Risk, Turning Business Threats into Competitive Advantage. Also with us today is Didier Bonnet, who's Senior VP and Global Practice Leader at Capgemini Consulting and head of its Digital Transformation Program. As well, we have Andy McAfee, who is the Principal Research Scientist at MIT Sloan's Initiative on the Digital Economy and co-author most recently of the New York Times bestseller, The Second Machine Age. I want to begin, first of all, by congratulating you guys. This is an extraordinary book, and it's sacrilege to say, but I'm going to invoke the great Peter Drucker for a minute and just say that there's something almost Drucker-esque about what you've done in the book, which is to unbelievably simplify a world that frankly most executives find overwhelming, ambiguous, impossible to kind of cope with, and what you've done is make coherent this, what did you guys call it, I think, the world of digital ubiquity, in a way that helps us begin to think about how we solve business problems and how digital transformation becomes something that every day we can use to make our companies compete better. So I want to begin by trying to take this idea of digital transformation and kind of wrestling it to the ground. So let me ask you first, can you think of a thing you use every day, a service, a product, something you use routinely that illustrates for us what digital transformation means and how it reflects how that company, its provider, thought differently about what the world should look like for them on the other side of digital transformation? George, let me start with you. Do you have an example?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Some things that seemed like rocket science years ago are just normal now. My cell phone, my email, you know, the fact I can Skype and FaceTime around the world, no problem, right? My favorite right now, though, is my Nike watch, my Nike running app. Because in the past, you know, when I'd be training for a goal, I had a log, and I would put things in the log, and sometimes I'd look back at the log, sometimes I wouldn't, right? Now my watch, it gets out there, first of all, it reminds me to run. But then second of all, when I'm done, it tells me how I did, and how I did compared to the last couple of times I went running. Today was kind of fun. I went running. Rafael Nadal came on and said, "Way to go, George." You know, nice to have that happen from time to time. Now, I can do more. Right? If I want more motivation, I can share this stuff with my friends on social media. I can do all those things. This is really helping to motivate me, helping me to train better than I ever could. The interesting thing, though, while all that's going on, Nike's learning from me. And they're learning from other people using the app.
So this is part of the Nike Plus program, right? That evolved out of a whole set of digital initiatives at Nike. So we're going to come back and talk about that because Nike's one of the great examples, and we can contrast them with what some others are doing. Didier, though, let me ask you for an example that also illustrates something you use or have used every day that helps to bring alive, make vivid what we mean by digital transformation.
So for me, I live in London, so I use taxi companies quite a lot, and I've seen a fundamental change in the way that I actually use taxis. So taxi, as you know, London's a big city as is Boston, but it's even bigger. So you can see thousands of lights passing you when you don't need a taxi, and when you do need one, there's none around, particularly when it's raining. And then there's a company called Halo, which was pre-Uber coming in, who came into the market, and they offer us a very simple app, and it allows me to not only have a beautiful app that tells me where the taxi is, but I can order a taxi from my office before I go out. I can wait until the taxi is closed and then go out on the streets. The driver will know where I am. I will have his name, his number plate. He will say, "Hello, Didier." Then I will get into the cab. They have all my details, so I don't have to produce any payments. It goes straight to my card. They send me an email with the receipt. I can zap to my wife, who's waiting for me at the restaurant, exactly where I am, so she'll know that I'm lying when I say I'll be there in 5. And more often they learn, so now they're offering me flat rates to the airport, because I've noticed that I go to the airport quite a lot. So there's all kind of relationship, and I had no clue about how all of this was working, nor did I really care. But I was really happy. So that's why I decided to go and meet these guys to write something about the case they had done, because it completely transformed my experience of taxi driving. And what was even more phenomenal when I went to talk to them is that what I did not realize is that they also transformed the taxi driver's life, because taxi drivers is a very lonely activity, and it's also you're half full or half empty most of the time, and they're really put an app which is completely different from the one I was looking at, that helped taxi drivers to communicate, a bit like a Facebook for taxis, but also giving them a whole pile of data on utilization, showing them how more money they were making than the day before, a whole pile of stats to see how much fuel they were spending. So they'd really managed to capture the two sides of the market in a way that was extremely powerful for me, because it was a complete change from having to run around in the rain trying to hail a cab in the past.
I love this example. I'm going to come to you, Andy, in a second here, but I want to stick with this for 1 second, because you guys tell the story really well in Leading Digital, and it does something really unusual. Here's an example of, we hear about disintermediation all the time as one of the byproducts of this new technology world, and yet here's an intermediation example. Somebody's actually gotten in between the taxi and the customer, which didn't used to happen on the streets of London.
And what I think is remarkable is, about 2 months ago, I was in another city in Europe, and I had to do something that we used to do only a year ago, is call a call center to get a cab. And God, that was a bad experience. And therefore my expectation had been set at this level, and anything beyond that is totally unacceptable.
Didn't
today.
you feel like you'd immediately gone back to the dark ages?
Exactly.
Like, why are you forcing me to
Yes, that's
do
right.
this antediluvian
and
thing?
wait and yeah, exactly.
So you have an example, a thing you use every day, Andy, that brings this alive?
Instead of giving one more example from Western, relatively affluent middle-aged guys, let me try to channel an up-and-coming member of India's middle class. And we came across a really interesting company called Asian Paints, which, as you can imagine, sells paints to Asians in India. And they used to be a classic business. They would make paint, they'd put it in a store, people would buy it. Paint is not a great business to be in these days. There are a lot of people entering the market. The margins are shrinking. It's pretty much becoming a commodity. So Asian Paints decided to do something radically different. They said, what if instead of selling you a can of paint, we actually sold you a correctly painted wall or room in your house, which would include a consultation with an interior decorator, which would include the people to actually show up and do the painting, which would include follow-up to make sure the customer is happy and the work got done. And they were able to bundle all of these services together, including the can of paint, and offer it out to the rising Indian middle class, which look kind of familiar to us. They're very busy. They have aspirations. They'd like to live in a nice place. And here is a company offering a really wonderful service in a part of the world that I wasn't expecting, that lets them realize those aspirations in a much easier way than they could before.
So how do they literally, if I'm a customer of Asian Paints, how do I get my wall, my paint wall? What do I do to get that wall from you?
George studied this one.
So, you could go to your retailer and buy a can of paint and some brushes and do it. You can also go to your retailer or call their call center and say, hey, I want my wall painted. And Asian Paints will be happy to arrange that for you. And what's nice about it is, they've got a lot of really good resources sitting around, people who are willing to work if they've got a job to do. They've got people who are too busy. And Asian Paints is putting that together into a great experience. It does one other thing too. They were finding that, especially on the more expensive paints, people were not happy with the paints. They said the paints were failing. It wasn't the paints failing, it was the painters failing. So now Asian Paints gives you somebody who knows how to use that. Your wall looks better, you like Asian Paints better, everybody's happy.
And right now, like George says, most of it happens via calling up somebody over the phone. My guess is that in a couple more years, that's going to be done via something that looks very much like an app on our smartphones today.
Yes, right. So one of the fascinating things about each of these examples is that they sort of pick up the threads that you guys focus on as the key, I'll call them the what levers in the book. You've talked about how customer experience has been changed in each of these cases. You've talked about operations being different. Asian Paints, obviously the taxi operation has become made much more efficient by what happens with Halo, also with Uber. And even the business models in each of these cases have been changed pretty radically. So I'm curious whether, I'm going to come back to Nike now and see whether you can start with where Nike started, because they started down this path, what, how long ago?
4 years ago.
Is it only 4 years ago that Nike Plus began? I mean,
actually, it's really interesting. Nike's been an amazing digital company in silos for years. 4 years ago, what they decided to do is they put together this group called Nike Digital Sport to start connecting these things together. And so where they were world class in digital marketing and social media marketing, they couldn't learn from social marketing to do product development. Where they were world class in digital in their design and transparency in their supply chain, they actually couldn't use that in other ways. So you put these things together now, and amazing things happen. So they can learn when my son orders custom shoes, they can watch what he's doing, learn from it to see whether other people like it. That might influence marketing. They can test marketing on products online before the shoes are ever built, see what happens, change it in the last minute. This is the kind of thing that's possible when you can put these things together as opposed to doing them separately.
so I'm going to imagine for a minute, like most of our viewers, that I'm not Nike, and that Nike feels like a far way down this road toward digital transformation. Can you map, in a way, how Nike, they began by creating capabilities in these silos, you say, basically? I mean, how do I get from here to there, if that makes sense? Is this question make sense?
It's one of the paths we noticed is the Nike path. Is there are a bunch of islands of excellence in the company, these separate efforts to become more digital, over here in marketing, over here in operations, here in supply chain. And one of the strongest patterns we noticed among the digital masters that we identified is at some point those all got stitched together and rolled up into something that became much more integrated, so that, like George's example points out, your operations can inform your marketing, can change how you're configuring your supply chain, and you start to get this virtuous cycle of benefits.
Now, what's typical? What would you say, among Nike's competitors? You don't need to name any names, but what would, all those companies have probably apps that have some kind of way to engage with the company and be alerted when a new version of your current shoe comes out and that kind of stuff. They don't do this. They don't get there. Why don't you think they get there? What gets in the way of them doing what Nike has done?
Well, one of the biggest things we see is that the leaders of these companies don't see the transformative potential of these technologies. So they tend to adopt these technologies to do kind of more of the same. Where these digital masters, they're thinking about radically changing things. So Nike is actually not thinking about putting digital to make products in. They're thinking about moving from somebody who sells you shoes to somebody who's a part of your life every day. And that changes the whole way you think about how you approach your customer.
And I think I would say, in addition, George, also what we saw in a number of these companies, the ability to do one thing extremely well, and once you've done that, it actually creates 2 or 3 other opportunities. If we can link that data with that type of information we already have, then we have something else we can provide. So it's more an incremental. I would say the vision wasn't very, very completely detailed from the beginning, but they really evolved this, and we've seen that in many companies where you do something well and suddenly it opens new doors, and that's the beauty of digital.
One of the points you make in the book is that you have to find a way to have a platform that does spread across silos so that information, data can be shared, acted on, et cetera. That sounds like a big challenge. Do I have to do that first before I start going down this path of transformation, or is there a smaller, more experimental way I can start trying to see what benefits I might derive from digital transformation before I have to, in fact, fix the data across my entire company and make sure that it is integrated.
You know, we did see a couple companies that re-platformed first, but that's a really tall order. Because, for example, at Lloyd's Bank, they built a new digital platform before they could move onward. But they had to invest an awful lot of money and several years with no return.
Yeah.
It's really tough. What we see as an alternative path is if you can lead this strongly from the top. You know, for all the stories about let's let the organization experiment, every digital master we saw led very strongly top down on making this happen. Now, if you can do that, if you can kind of set a direction and then start doing things, then every experiment you do builds on the next. Every experiment you do starts to integrate with the next. And your platform kind of catches up with you as you're moving forward. Yeah. If you try to do it without that top-down leadership, it's like herding cats. And you end up with all this spaghetti everywhere, and there's no way to tie that together in a good way.
Didier, were you surprised to find that this process had to be driven top-down?
To some extent, yes. Well, as much as we found it, yes, because the expectations from the beginning, for me, at least whatever I was reading, was all about this notion of, Gen Y and bring your own device and edge innovation. So you got led to believe that there was going to be like a swarm of innovation coming out bottom up. And I'm not saying having Gen Y who are innovative is not a good thing, but certainly we didn't see that generating radical transformation of the kind that we've seen with Digital Masters. In each cases, we found also just good old strong leadership from the top, really driving this thing, not necessarily people that were hugely technology aware, but people that understood the power of this technology to actually change what they're trying to achieve in business, or realizing that a lot of the constraints by which they design their businesses, processes, and so on, you could actually get rid of through new digital technology, data, and so on. So that was really to me, there was a surprising finding how strong the top-down leadership was, and in the company where the leadership was not that strong, it was quite obvious that they were dealing with the detail that we're talking about now. They're trying to get two departments to talk to each other, and they were getting stuck there rather than really pushing forward for a new model of operation. Which and that takes leadership is not just the CEO. It takes also an alignment of a group of people, a coalition of group of people at the top to really push in. And it's the only real way to leverage the young guys, the people with below. When you engage them, then you can really leverage that. But you need the leadership first.
And we should be clear, when we talk about a top-down approach, the idea is not that the detailed project plan and roadmap comes from the CEO's office and it's this incredibly rigid, hierarchical, voice from the mountaintop approach to technology and organization.
And Soviet 5-year plan.
Right, so that's the image we actually really don't want to have. It's not inflexible, it's not centralized, it's not the case that you can't question it, but what we saw over and over was when the organization knew where it was going, or at least had a shared idea of what the point was, why we were doing this, where we're trying to get. That's a fairly light layer of top-down, and that's what we're talking about.
You guys make a great point about this in the book by talking about the vision. I almost hate to invoke vision in a panel like this, but you try to make a distinction between what you call vision and transformative vision in leading digital. And I'd love to hear you describe that a little bit so that we can try to take the quotation marks off the vision word and make it real, to try to talk about the question that you think a CEO, a top leader, needs to be able to answer for the organization before you start to try to engage the entire organization and make the transformation happen. Talk about vision a little bit.
So we did, if we could find another word, we'd have used another word than vision, but we couldn't. So we used vision and transformative vision, but it was very clear sometimes where we talked to these leaders that some people were still in the mold of, I'm going to use digital to delight my customer, and I said, oh, great. So what do you do on Monday morning? And we saw quite a lot of that. I'm caricaturing, but we did see a lot of that. and then at the other hand, you had people like GE, for instance, with the industrial internet, that were going, okay, what is that? So I start looking at it, and the combination of engineering and data to really radically change what they did and how they price and how they serve clients and how they do maintenance. Of course, they didn't know all that at the beginning, but they just throw the envelope really, pretty far, throw the ball pretty far. And I think we've seen quite a number of people using this as a tool to get the organization going. And it was very, very, it's, you know, the word vision sometimes is a bit blurry, but there was a huge gap between the former example that I use and
Well, stick with that for a minute. You use, correct me if I've got this phrase wrong, but the phrase is something like, what will this business look like on the other side of digital transformation? It's not about delight. Nobody's going to say, this business will look more delightful on the other side of digital transformation. There's something concrete about the picture that you're asking to be drawn on the other side. So in GE's case, what would they, when they're thinking about what their business was going to look like on the other side, what are they imagining, Didier? What are they talking about?
I think they were trying to understand the, you know, how this technology could fundamentally change what. I mean, remember they were, you know, in an era of Internet of Things, and that's really close to a manufacturing company. Like, and they knew something was going to change. So I think the industrial internet was kind of a catchphrase to sort of say there is something beyond what we do today. Which is going to be a different way of connecting with customer, a different way of actually pricing for jet engines, a different way of doing maintenance, as I mentioned. So that, you know, that catchphrase actually fundamentally changed a number of the core processes and functions that the company was doing, and that's really what attracted me. And we saw the same with Burberry's. We saw the same. So it's not just one industry. We saw that across quite a large number of companies.
One of my favorite examples there is Caesars, the entertainment, the gambling company, which has been really effectively led by Gary Loveman for a long time. And his vision was we are going to be more analytical about our customers, about trying to get them to come to us as opposed to somebody else, to come back more often, to give us more of their share of their total entertainment dollar over time. And he was just repeatedly clear to his employees about what that was going to entail. My favorite story, I don't think it's apocryphal, was that when he got his employees together, he would always say to them, there are 3 ways to get fired at this company. You can steal from us, you can harass a coworker, or you can fail to have a control group for an experiment. And just getting your workforce to the point where they would understand what that last one meant, that's a big deal. That's a great encapsulation of a vision and a journey.
You know, what's important about these visions is not only that they tell you where you're going, they tell you kind of what's appropriate in there. So the Gary Loveman is a perfect example of that. In GE, you know, this idea of the industrial internet is not only that, but now all our products that we make across this company actually have to start talking to each other in ways they never could before. You know, we may have to build up services we never had to make sense of all this data before. And so if you're going to build a new product that can't talk to the other products, that doesn't follow the vision, and we got some rules about that.
So it definitely sort of sketches out what you must do, and in some cases, like Loveman's, what you must not do, right? Stick with Caesars for a minute, because George, you've talked a lot about the way that Caesars went from this analytics-driven company, still is analytics-driven, but it has led them, to my surprise, I guess, to some places that I don't naturally assume are part of kind of analytics. Describe the, what is it called? The concierge in your pocket? What's it?
Sure, yeah. So this is really interesting, right? So, you know, Caesars, like a lot of companies, the gaming companies, they've got certain customers who spend a lot of money at the casino. And these companies treat them very well. They tend to give you a lot of personal service. They tend to look after you very nicely. Caesars noticed a couple of years back that these people, they call them whales, were showing up with smartphones. And they said, what can we do? And the first thing they did was just put some basic functionality on the smartphone. You know, you can look up your total rewards balance, this kind of thing. But then they started doing other things. They put in a service where if you land at the airport, you can text that you're here. And when you get to Caesar's Palace, you don't stand in the registration line. The bell captain has your key and you walk right upstairs. Right? They go on now. They do a lot of mobile couponing with you to see whether you want to go to the show, whether you want to do this kind of thing. They can track where you are in the location. So when you step out of Caesar's Palace, they catch you to the next Caesar's property down the way. But what they've done is with their best customers, they're learning that their best customers actually prefer this sometimes. They've basically taken that personal concierge and stuck it in the pockets of their best customers.
And that sounds a little bit obvious. Well, of course there'd be an app for that when you talk about it. Think how rare it still is. Gary has this wonderful imagery. He says, look, I'm on my phone all the time. I am one of the best customers. my mobile phone, my mobile carrier has in the country. When I walk into the store at the mall, someone should run out from behind the counter, throw rose petals in front of my path and give me absolute A-level service. Nothing like that happens. And it makes absolutely no sense in today's world. His great insight, his company's great insight was, look, we can actually take care and should take care of our best customers in this digital way. And then like George says, why stop there? Let's take care of our second best and our third best customers in appropriate ways, because the marginal cost of doing that is so low thanks to technology.
I want to capture sort of that sense of you having discovered some things that are surprising, I suppose, to you in the course of doing the research here. You have companies, for instance, as you said just now, DDA, who say, I want an intelligent business. I want my products and services to be intelligent, and yet somehow the process never starts. Something gets in the way. I don't know. That probably wasn't surprising to you, but I'd love for each of you to say, in the course of this, what jumped out at you, despite all of your experience working with companies in this space, as a surprise, something novel that you didn't expect to find when you were working on leading digital. I'll start with you, George. What was surprising?
I think about it this way, right? You can use digital to turn a caterpillar into a digital butterfly. And unfortunately, most of the companies we were studying were using digital just to make caterpillars a lot faster. Yeah. And you're not going to survive that way.
Yeah, I think that's a big point. I was trying to find, we've seen such contrast between your example of the caterpillar and the butterfly, and I was trying to put my hand on what is it that really changes. And I think it was you started talking about Peter Drucker. I think he said, if you want to do something new, you have to stop doing something old, right? Yeah. Unfortunately, I think we saw so many companies sticking technology in an existing process, forgetting that the reason you designed this process in the first place was for all sorts of constraints that existed 20 years ago sometimes. And I couldn't express it better than saying, the people that did that well, I sense were zero-basing their processes, saying, okay, we have to perform the following function. Like Caesar, we need to know where the customer is. Well, today you can. We need to have this pile of data. Well, you can. We need to make this decision or put this offer. Well, you can. And really take all these constraints out of the process, zero-base it completely, and redesign something that is fundamentally a different experience. And I think Halo was the example I used earlier. And I think when I look at what they were doing, the CEO of the company said, there is no magic in the technology we've used. Zero. It was, cell phones, and it was very...
Taxis and cell phones.
Taxis,
we've got
cell
those.
phones, and apps. I mean, everything that existed there, but how you weave it in a different experience because you've decided to throw away the old process and put that in place. The contrast is people saying, oh, well, we need our sales guys to be equipped. Let's give them an iPad, and we put the product catalog on it, and we put exactly what they have in paper. That doesn't really help, and we saw quite a bit of that.
Well, I've heard you draw the really interesting analog between this zero-based approach, really looking at what business problem do you want to solve? What way do you want to add new value to the customer experience at a profit versus re-engineering? You were describing how...
Yes, at the risk of sounding old-fashioned or people discovering my age, but I did live
It's not that big a secret.
Not that big a secret. It was, we did live through the re-engineering, actually to the point where it got bad press at some point because, you were basically sort of micromanaging the detail of a process. But I think there is some elements of what I see now that looks like that. And that's why I call it this kind of zero-based re-engineering with the power of digital.
Instead of taking that existing process and revising it.
Well, let me try to bring these two things together because like George says, we were explicit that we did not go to Silicon Valley to do our research. And we both, all three of us, spend a lot of time there. We are deeply respectful of what they do. The reason we didn't is that, like George says, most of the rest of the economy thinks since they're not full of 24-year-olds with 140 IQs working 90 hours a week for pre-IPO options, they think there's nothing to take away from what's going on in the Valley. So we wanted to talk about the other 94% of the economy and what's going on there. What we saw over and over was what I think the Valley is so good at, which is looking around with fresh eyes and saying, this thing that we're doing, this could be a lot better. And it's really surprisingly easy to see in retrospect and hard to do in advance. It never occurred to me that the process of getting a cab and going someplace in a major city around the world was irrevocably broken. I thought that's just how things worked. Now, thanks to things like Halo and Uber, I find it irrevocably broken to hop into a cab. But that insight, that comes from someone doing what Didier said, which is zero-basing things, really having a fresh eye, but then having the tenacity to do the hard work of changing the technology and changing the organization so you can realize that vision.
You know, this is another important point out of this too, is that, you know, we got so many ingrained assumptions about what's possible because we grew up in the PC era or before that, right? And these things are going away, and Silicon Valley is so good about it. The other thing we need to realize is that the customers of most companies have different expectations now. So once we say Uber's the experience we want to go through, taxis are a really bad experience now, right? We would talk to retailers, and they'd say, you know, our customers keep asking us, why can't we be as good as the Apple Store? Well, now they have to be that good, right? And so if you're not testing your own assumptions and asking what assumptions you need to break because of digital, your customers are already doing it. And so it's time to rethink how to make that work.
So you're saying customers are, in effect, far more digitally transformed than companies?
Then the customers and their
Yeah, that's a problem,
expectations.
right.
That's right.
I want to take a little bit of time to get first steps from you guys. Again, you know, almost all the examples we talk about are examples that are very fully realized examples of companies doing extraordinary things, having really remade experiences. So let's imagine for a minute, and I'd love for each of you to be able to say something about this. Imagine that the moment has come and you are invited into a top management team at an organization, and they have not wrestled with this digital thing before, but they finally realize they need to, and they want to begin down this path. They want to say, help me become a digital master. Literally, where do you start? What's the first thing you try to help them understand or address? What do you say?
I then try to understand what it is that you're trying to achieve, basically. So it's a very non-digital question, but I get too often people saying, I want a digital strategy. And they're usually people that already have a social media strategy, a mobile strategy, an analytics strategy, and so there's loads of strategy. And I said, look, forget about that. You have a strategy, right? You want to go into emerging markets, you want to launch a new product, you want to do that. So that's your strategy. Now let's see how digital can help that faster, cheaper, quicker. Cut out a bunch of physical retail, for instance, out of the process, and really put the filter of digital on top of the strategy. But I try to get clarity first as to what are you trying to achieve. The second thing that gives me a hint whether they're ready or not is the alignment. So if I talk to 5 or 6 people in the same team, do I get the same sort of tone of direction, or do I get completely diverging views? Because the alignment for me is really important. If you're going to drive, since leadership, as we say, is so important, it's not just one person, it's the whole team's got to be aligned towards what they're going to be doing, because it's really hard, and everybody's going to have to push the next layer, which is the happy few who run all the functions and the business unit and all that to get them to move in the same direction. So those two things to me give me a hint of whether the person is saying, let's talk digital and I'm not going to do anything, or let's talk digital because I want to, get ready. And
so I'm curious, I could guess the answer to this, but what do you typically find when it comes to alignment?
So, it's very varied, but I would say that the majority is not aligned, but for a simple reason, is because they're all, I find a lot of executives still struggling. You've got the technology people, so usually the IT person or the CTO, really pushing to say, look at all these great things, and sometimes these people, we've got entire teams going to California, and I kind of describe that now as Jurassic Park. It's kind of, you go see the animals, and then you leave, and it's nice and safe. You go back to your office and you do nothing. So there's a lot of friction like that, and then you have the marketing person that says, well, I'm already I'm sorted, I'm already doing my thing. So it's not so much about bad will, but it's the thing that they have never had the debate about how is digital going to impact our industry. What is the stuff that if we could cut costs by 30% would really make a difference? How can we sell more into emerging market, and how? Because we can't afford the retail distribution, the physical retail distribution. Those kind of questions to me is what unroll the strategy with a digital bit, and then you start really moving.
And some of this I don't know whether you do it that way, but some of this you uncover before the fact. You're talking to people before the meetings, you're trying to figure out where they're and how people are aligned. But you do have those people that are just saying, oh, this is just this again.
Right.
I can outweight this. And so the idea of trying to figure out where that is and help people get a little closer aligned is good.
Yeah, I realize it's an unfair question because you would have done something before walking into the room. It doesn't start cold quite like this, at least not usually. Andy, so here you are. It's day one. You're walking in. It's the first meeting. You've told the joke. That's over, and now we're ready to where do you begin?
Well, I've actually been living this pretty specifically for the past couple of years. In the fall of 2012, Eric Brynjolfsson and I published an article called Big Data, the Management Revolution. Pretty quickly after that, my phone started ringing off the hook with all kinds of companies and leadership teams going, we need some of that big data. Can you come help us with that? And my first question to them was always, like Didier says, forget about that. Talk to me about your business. Tell me where you want to take it over the next non-crazy time frame, 3 to 5 years, where do you want to take the business? And that conversation is really interesting. Once in a while, you hear something like a Caesar's vision, an Asian Paints vision, a Nike vision, a Halo vision. Instead, though, what you hear more often is fear. Our margins are going away, our customers are churning, there's all this bad stuff going on. Or just a really, in many cases, an underwhelming answer to that question. You know, I'd like to take the gross margins from X% to Y%. I'd like to grab a couple more points of market share. And so just that initial question gets people, I hope, thinking in the right direction, but also gives me a lot of feedback about where this company is in their thought process. The strong implication there is, let's not talk about technology. And the instant that in that room, there's somebody around the table, usually the CIO, who starts talking about this CRM implementation is going to fix all of our trouble, or we're migrating up to the cloud, and they just dive right down into those tech weeds, usually not a great sign.
Is that the time when you invite that guy out of the room as quickly as possible so that you can make progress, or what? I mean, I guess the question is the CIO, CTO, CDO, is he or she an ally in this process often, or frankly an impediment early stage when you're trying to get to digital transformation?
Yeah, yes, they're all the above. You have to involve the technology professionals at some point in the journey, but if they're not the right team to get you there, you've got to take that into account.
Yeah, and I would say, I think we say it several times now, or we push several times the message of leadership. It depends on the people. So I think the function then doesn't give you a right to be a leader or something like that. So we find people actually, like Codelco, which George looked at, where the CIO is actually driving probably the entire show. Asian Paints the same. So you do have these people who actually are leading, but it's not across the board. What I would say is that, answer to your question about throwing the IT guy out the room, I wouldn't do that. I would force the IT person to have the business discussion first and leave the technology on the table later. Because what we did find is that at the end of the day, most of the digital masters that we look at had got the technology people working with the business pretty closely. So I wouldn't exclude it by any shape or form. I would, au contraire, trying to reintegrate, to reintegrate those skills into the business discussion.
Let me say thank you, guys. This has been fabulous. Thank you so much for your insights today. Thank you for writing Leading Digital. It's a terrific book and a real contribution to the management literature and also fun. Thank you for joining us for this panel on making digital transformation happen. Please join us next time.